Judge was ready to sentence him, until he realized who the black man really was. Enjoy the story. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor of Chicago's municipal court. Dorothy Washington sat rigid in the defendant's chair, her dark hands folded precisely in her lap, spine straight despite the weight of humiliation pressing down on her shoulders. At 52, she possessed the kind of quiet dignity that comes from weathering storms without breaking. Skin the color of burnished copper, silver threading through her carefully maintained hair, and eyes that had seen too much yet refused to look away. The orange jumpsuit hung loose on her frame, a cruel uniform that stripped away her usual armor of pressed blouses and sensible shoes. She stared ahead, jaw set, as the prosecutor shuffled through papers with theatrical indifference. The courtroom buzzed with the mechanical rhythm of processed justice. Dorothy had been here for 3 hours, watching case after case blur together in a parade of forgotten people. The prosecutor, a young woman with sharp heels and sharper ambitions, read charges in a monotone voice that made human suffering sound, like inventory. Disturbing the peace, trespassing, resisting arrest. Each word fell like a gavel, sealing fates with surgical precision. Dorothy's fingers tightened imperceptibly as her name was called, but her expression never wavered. She had learned long ago that showing emotion in spaces like this was a luxury she couldn't afford. Judge Martin Hoffner looked up from his stack of files with the weary expression of a man who had sentenced too many lives to boxes that were too small. He was approaching retirement, his gray hair thinning, his patience worn down to the nub. By 23 years of seeing the same faces recycled through his courtroom, Dorothy Washington's case file was thin. No prior arrests, no history of violence, just a single incident that had somehow landed her here among the repeat offenders and usual suspects. He glanced at her briefly, noting the way she held herself, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her stillness. Something about her presence felt different, but he had learned not to trust first impressions in this place where desperation wore many faces. The prosecutor painted Dorothy as a disruptive force, a woman who had flagrantly violated the peace of Millennium Park during the annual Harvest Festival. Witnesses described shouting, physical confrontation, and aggressive behavior toward event security. The words hung in the air like accusations, each one carefully chosen to create a narrative of guilt. Dorothy listened without flinching, her breathing steady and controlled. She had expected this, the way her story would be twisted, how her voice would be silenced by the very system she had once believed in. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was being judged in a building where she had once walked these same halls with purpose and authority. The public defender assigned to Dorothy's case was a tired-looking man in his 40s who had clearly given up fighting the system long ago. He mumbled through a perfunctory defense, citing her clean record and asking for leniency. His words lacked conviction, delivered with the resigned efficiency of someone going through the motions. Dorothy wanted to speak, to tell her side of the story, to explain what had really happened at that festival, but her lawyer had advised silence. "Let me handle this," he had said, but his handling felt more like surrender. She bit her tongue and watched justice being served like fast food, quick, cheap, and ultimately unsatisfying. What the courtroom didn't know, what the files couldn't capture, was the truth behind Dorothy's presence at that festival. She hadn't come as a disruptor, but as a concerned citizen, drawn by reports that the city's new community partnership with private security was targeting black and brown families, forcing them to leave public spaces through intimidation and manufactured violations. Dorothy had witnessed a security guard cornering a young mother with her children, demanding identification and threatening arrest for loitering near the playground. When Dorothy intervened, asking to see the guard's authority and questioning his right to harass families in a public park, the situation had escalated. But in the cold language of police reports, her advocacy became aggression, her questions became resistance, and her presence became a crime. The weight of institutional indifference pressed down on Dorothy as the proceedings continued. She thought of her grandmother, who had cleaned the offices of civil rights lawyers in the 1960s, who had taught her that dignity was something no one could take away unless you gave it to them. She thought of her daughter, Keisha, who was probably pacing their kitchen right now, furious and helpless, forbidden by Dorothy from attending this hearing. Some battles, Dorothy had told her, you have to fight alone. But sitting here now, surrounded by the machinery of a system that seemed designed to chew up people like her, Dorothy wondered if this was a battle she could win, or if winning was even the point anymore. Judge Hoffner was reaching for his gavel when something made him pause. Perhaps it was the way Dorothy sat, not defeated, not defiant, but present in a way that commanded attention without demanding it. He had seen thousands of defendants pass through his courtroom, and most fell into familiar categories. But Dorothy Washington didn't fit any of them. There was something in her bearing, a quality he couldn't quite name that made him want to look closer. He glanced at her file again, noting the address, the employment history, the complete absence of any criminal record. A nagging feeling tugged at the edge of his consciousness, as if he should recognize something he was missing. The prosecutor was summarizing her case for sentencing when a court clerk hurried forward with a folder. She whispered something urgent in the judge's ear. Her face flushed with what looked like embarrassment. Judge Hoffner's expression changed, his eyes widening slightly as he opened the folder and scanned its contents. The color drained from his face as he read, and for a moment, the courtroom fell into an unexpected silence. Dorothy watched him, with growing curiosity, noting the way his hands trembled slightly as he set the papers down. Something had shifted in the room's atmosphere, a tension that hadn't been there moments before. The judge cleared his throat and looked directly at Dorothy for the first time since her case had begun. "Ms. Washington," he said, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before, "I need to ask you something directly. Are you currently employed by the Cook County judicial system?" Dorothy's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady as she replied, "Yes, Your Honor. I am the Chief Administrative Officer for the Cook County Circuit Court." The words fell into the courtroom like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through every corner of the room. The prosecutor's mouth dropped open, the public defender looked up from his notes in confusion, and the court clerk who had brought the folder stepped back as if she'd been burned. Have you ever experienced or witnessed someone being judged before their story was fully heard? Share your thoughts in the comments. Judge Hoffner set down his gavel with deliberate care, the metal making no sound against the wooden block. The silence that followed was deafening, filled with the weight of recognition and the sick realization of what had almost happened. Dorothy Washington wasn't just another defendant. She was a colleague, a woman who had worked in the judicial system for over 15 years, who had implemented reforms to ensure fair treatment for defendants, who had fought for resources for public defenders, and who was now sitting in an orange jumpsuit because no one had bothered to look beyond the surface of her case. The irony was so sharp it could cut, and everyone in the room felt its edge. The prosecutor was the first to break, her face flushing red as she realized the magnitude of what she had almost done. She had been preparing to send a fellow officer of the court to jail without ever bothering to investigate the circumstances of her arrest. The public defender looked sick, suddenly understanding why his client had seemed so familiar, why her calm demeanor had struck him as unusual. But it was Judge Hoffner who felt the weight most heavily. He had nearly sentenced a woman whose reforms had improved his own courtroom, whose advocacy had made the system more just for countless defendants who had stood where she now sat. The truth began to emerge like water through a cracked dam. Dorothy's arrest had been a case of mistaken identity, compounded by racial profiling and systemic failure. The security guards at the festival had assumed she was a troublemaker because she was a black woman questioning their authority. The responding officers had accepted their version of events without investigation. The booking process had focused on charges rather than identity, and the system, the very system Dorothy had devoted her career to improving, had processed her like any other defendant, stripping away her humanity along with her civilian clothes. As the details unfolded, Dorothy felt a complex mix of vindication and sorrow. She was relieved that the truth was finally emerging, but heartbroken that it had taken her position and status to matter. How many other defendants had sat in this same chair with stories equally valid but voices equally unheard? How many had been processed through this system without anyone bothering to look beyond the surface? The weight of these questions pressed down on her as heavily as her own humiliation, because she knew that her rescue was an exception that proved a much more troubling rule. Judge Hoffner called for a recess, but before clearing the courtroom he did something unprecedented. He stood and addressed Dorothy directly, his voice carrying the gravity of both apology and recognition. "Ms. Washington, this court owes you not just an apology, but a debt of gratitude for the reminder you've provided today. Your case will be dismissed, all charges dropped, and the record expunged. But more importantly, your experience here will serve as a catalyst for the reforms this system desperately needs." Dorothy nodded, accepting his words while knowing that the real work was just beginning. The dismissal of charges was just the beginning of Dorothy's transformation from victim to catalyst. Within weeks, her case had become a focal point for discussions about racial bias in the justice system, the importance of thorough investigation, and the need for systemic reform. Dorothy used her experience to push for new protocols that would prevent similar incidents, advocating for mandatory bias training, improved booking procedures, and better communication between law enforcement and the courts. Her voice, once silenced by circumstance, now carried the authority of someone who had experienced the system from both sides. Dorothy stood outside the courthouse 6 months later, not as a defendant, but as a reformer, watching as the new protocols she had helped design were implemented. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps, but the light felt different now, warmer, more hopeful. She thought about all the defendants who would benefit from these changes, the voices that would be heard because hers had been silenced first. The orange jumpsuit was gone, replaced by her familiar professional attire, but she carried the memory of that humiliation as a reminder of how quickly dignity could be stripped away and how important it was to fight for its restoration. Her experience had transformed her from an administrator of justice into its guardian, and she had never felt more purposeful in her work. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding injustice, but from transforming it into change. Dorothy. Washington's story reminds us that dignity isn't diminished by circumstance. It's revealed by how we choose to respond to it. Her moment of powerlessness became a source of power for countless others, proving that sometimes we must be broken by a system before we can fix it. You are amazing. If you genuinely enjoyed this story, please leave a like and subscribe. It's a great feedback for me. If it made you feel seen, heard, or simply reminded you that change is still possible, share it with someone who needs a little hope today. See you.